Good evening, everybody. I want to call the November 16th, 2017 meeting of the Vermont Nuclear Decommissioning Panel to order. My name is Kate O'Connor, and I am chair of the panel, and I'm a citizen appointee, having been appointed by Governor Shumlin. And our first order of business will be to introduce ourselves, and we'll start down at this end with Representative Dean.
David Dean, at-large member appointed by the Speaker of the House.
David Andrews, representing the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers.
Jim Mathel, citizen member appointed by the Senate President Pro Tem.
Derek Jordan, appointed by Speaker of the House, citizen member.
I'm Riley Allen. I'm representing June Tierney here. I'm Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Public Service.
I've got two mics now. Aren't you going? Oh, okay. Lissa Weinman, citizen representative, appointed by the Senate Pro Tem.
Chuck Schwer, Agency of Natural Resources.
Steve Skibniowski, representing the town of Vernon, appointed by the Vernon Select Board.
Good evening. I'm Jack Boyle from Entergy, Vermont Yankee. I'm the decommissioning director.
Good evening. Mike McKinney. I'm from Entergy. I'm the technical coordinator for decommissioning.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Just so the panel knows, we are not ready to approve the minutes of the October meeting, but we will have them at our next meeting in January, and we'll have drafts out prior to then, but they'll be ready for approval then. Oh, I'm sorry. Tony's reminding me that there are people on the line. Tony, do you know who they are? Why don't you, Tony, tell us who they are, and then they can introduce themselves.
Okay, and on the line this evening, panelist-wise, we have Dr. Bill Irwin, Robert Gustafson, and Katie Buckley should be able to hear us as well.
Can you folks all...
This is Bill Irwin. I represent the Agency of Human Services. I work for the Vermont Department of Health.
And this is Robert Gustafson, and I'm appointed for the state of New Hampshire to sit in on the panel.
This is Katie Buckley. I'm Secretary Sterling's designee representing the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, state of Vermont.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Is that everybody? All right. As I was saying, we're going to wait until the January meeting to have the minutes for October, but we will circulate them prior, hopefully by the end of this month or beginning of next month, so everyone will have them. Just as a quick overview, this is if we stay on schedule, we're going to be getting done at 8:15, which is 45 minutes earlier than we normally do. But we'll see what happens. And I guess we might as well get right into it and have, I guess it's going to be Joe that's going to give us an update on behalf of Entergy.
Thank you, Kate, and good evening, everyone. It's only been a few weeks since we last met, but I wanted to go over a couple of changes at the plant since the last meeting. In regards to our dry fuel storage project, we have now successfully loaded 18 casks since we started the campaign in 2017. So we have 31 of the total of 58 casks loaded and stored on either one or other of the ISFAC pads. And again, our target is to have all fuel transferred by the end of 2018, assuming that we have certain NRC approvals that we're in the process of receiving. Right now, we're in a maintenance window. I think I announced at the last meeting that once we reach the 18th cask, we were going to take approximately 3 weeks off to go through normal preventive maintenance of the equipment that handles the fuel. So we're in that window right now. Our target is to recommence fuel movements right after the Thanksgiving holiday, and we'll have an update at the next meeting what our progress is.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
What NRC approvals are you waiting for?
There are certain approvals required for the cask to accept certain types of fuel. So it's the Holtec cask COC certificate of conformance. So it's not an Entergy approval, it's a Holtec approval.
Okay, but I'm surprised that we're this far into moving the stuff out of the spent fuel pool and we're waiting for NRC approval?
Well, I wasn't prepared to talk in detail on, what the NRC approvals are, but in essence, we had talked about the fact that we've been able to accelerate the loading campaign. So the amount of cooling that's required for the fuel has been gone from about 5 years to about 3.5 years. And part of that is to go through a process of the NRC approving that. So up to this point, we've been loading fuel that didn't need that.
Okay, so it's hotter fuel. That's the issue before the NRC.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I didn't know it was an issue.
Another new project that I described in the last couple meetings was the reduction of the site protected area around the two fuel pads. We now have all the permits in hand, a total of 6 permits that are required to go forward with that project. I have a slide that says, or a bullet that says construction was to commence in November. I think that construction was actually started today. So we are moving forward with that, weather contingent. We again need certain things from the NRC, in this case changes to our physical security plan before implementation, but again the target for completion of this project is the end of 2018, so we should have ample time for that. Same picture I showed last time. This is showing that both pads now are getting pretty filled up with either canisters that are loaded or ones that are going to be accepting new fuel going into the future. And we continue to receive either the overpacks, the high storms, or the canisters from Holtec and have them stored and ready for loading at the site. As far as water management, we continue to be very successful in the reduction of groundwater entering into the turbine building. Even since the last meeting, the efforts that we recently took place to reduce intrusion water now has the current rate of intrusion into the turbine building down to around 200 to 250 gallons per day. If you remember back two and a half years ago, we were up over 3,000 gallons per day, so we've seen an over 90% reduction since 2015. Once again, the groundwater intrusion is confined to the turbine building. It's clean water that's entering into the building. Once it becomes contact with the structure, that's where it picks up some contamination and becomes very, very low radioactivity. We continue to ship water down to Tennessee at the Energy Solutions disposal site in Tennessee. The latest number is 623,000 gallons has been shipped to date, and we continue not discharging any water into the Connecticut River. At the last meeting, there was a question from Peter Walk of Agency for Natural Resources in regards to how much money we've spent for the disposal of water and how does that compare to our original decommissioning cost estimate. To date, we have spent $3.2 million on shipping water. At the last meeting, you heard me say that's around $4 a gallon. So the actual cost of shipment is just over $2.5 million, and then there's about $600,000 in handling costs. So the labor to move the water from the turbine building to the frac tanks, to the tankers for the last 3 years. Compared to the decommissioning cost estimate, we had a budget of just under $10 million overall for the whole project in regards to what we call water processing. We did not anticipate that we would have this kind of water, so some of the payment of the costs are coming out of contingency. That and the fact that the overall project is under budget has allowed us to continue to ship water and not impact the overall budget. In regards to the 2 approvals that we need for the transaction of selling Entergy to North Star, if those go through, completed recent milestone was the 3rd and final round of discovery requests on the petitioners were sent to us on October 30th. Our response to the Department of Public Service, Agency for Natural Resources, and Conservation Law Foundation are due, I believe, tomorrow, but I think we were going to be submitting those early as today. Can't verify, but definitely by tomorrow. We then owe responses to New England Coalition by November 28th. The next milestone is non-petitioners filing their rebuttal testimony. That's due on December 1st. Another key milestone for the overall project that should be of interest to the public is a second PUC hearing, which is set for January 4th in Vernon. I think we're still trying to get confirmation it's going to be at the elementary school, but once that information is out, we will certainly pass that along. And then finally, the technical hearings are scheduled for the last 2 weeks of January, 22nd and 29th. In regards to the NRC license transfer application update, again, we filed our license transfer application back in February. Just recently, on November 3rd, we did receive what are known as requests for additional information. So these are inquiries from the NRC to get more information to them to be able to review our application and hopefully approve it. We owe them a response back roughly 30 days later. That will be on December 4th. We have not heard anything further from the Commission in regards to their decision on the request for hearing by both the State of Vermont and New England Coalition. And that kind of brings you up to date on both NRC and the Public Utility Commission. And then finally, the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund update. This continues to be a very good story. I last reported at the end of September, we had a balance of $575.6 million. The balance at the end of October was $577.9 million. So it continues to see very strong market gains. That, of course, is offset by the qualified withdrawals. So to date in 2017, we have withdrawn just under $30 million, $29.6 million. We have seen just under $49 million in market gains and about $3 million in fund expenses. And then finally, the Site Restoration Trust balance at the end of October was $25.3 million. So that's seen a $5.3 million growth since we started funding that. And the last and final payment will be made by the end of this year, a total of $25 million. So that'll bring us likely over $30 million at the end of the year for the Site Restoration Trust balance. And that was the end of my presentation, so I guess I'll hold off on questions until after the state.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Now we have an update from the state, and I know we have Steph Hoffman with the Department of Public Service.
Madam Chair?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I do have a question, and I believe there's another question here also.
We were going to wait. You want to do it now, or are we going to listen to Steph and Kyle and then do questions, or what would you prefer?
Well, this is an explanation of the request for additional information. What additional information? And I'll take the answer after we're done. But
while you're there, Joe, you might as well answer.
Sure. Anytime you go through the process of requesting modification to your license, the NRC first goes through an acceptance review within the first 30 days of you submitting your license application. And then as they go through the detailed review, they oftentimes will find questions they have with your submittal. So they're either resolved by a phone call, and if there's something that needs a more detailed explanation, they'll actually send us a letter with a series of questions, and then we have 30 days typically to respond back. That way all the information is on the docket. So this is kind of a routine process. When there's a complicated submittal, they'll ask for these additional questions, and we'll then submit our answers, like I said, about 30 days later. So that's what it is in this case.
Are any of those questions of interest to this panel?
I honestly don't know what the exact questions are. They are in Adams, so they're publicly available. I can maybe look it up during a break to see what they are, but
thank you.
I think they're primarily financial in nature, but I can be more specific.
And perhaps what we can do as well is find where they are between Tony and Joe, and we can email everybody the link to so they can see it.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they're on our website as well. So as soon as those letters, they're on viewidecommissioning.com.
Oh, okay. So we can make sure that we get it out to everybody tomorrow, so we can all see what the questions are. Does that make sense? Okay. So we've got Steph Hoffman from the Kyle Landis Marinello is going to go first. He's from the Attorney General's office.
I figured I'd just hop in again. Kyle Landis Marinello from the AG's office, because I think I can speak to that question a little bit, and the document's available. But as Joe said, there's no update on the hearing request at the NRC. But in the meanwhile, the NRC staff has asked these questions that I think do parallel a number of the issues we've been raising in the request for a hearing on the financial matters. So just a couple of the questions go to, one is there's a permission that Entergy has to use the decommissioning trust fund for spent fuel expenses. The NRC is asking whether North Star is able to use that exemption if they were to take over the plant. Second issue is whether North Star can count on future recoveries from the U.S. Department of Energy for spent fuel expenses. Third question is whether the calculations used to determine the $125 million, if those calculations are adequate. A fourth question is whether that number, the $125 million in financial assurance that's been proposed, should have escalation factor year by year to account for inflation, I believe is what they're getting at. And then a fifth question on the financial issues is whether this support agreement is the right form of financial assurance, or should it be something like a parent guarantee, which is more what the NRC is used to. So those parallel a lot of the same questions that our office, joined by the Department of Public Service, have asked in our request for a hearing before the NRC. There are also a couple questions that go to technical issues about the responsibilities and experience of senior managers who would be taking on this project at North Star, yes. And that's the only update on the NRC side of things.
Kyle, can I ask you a question, Kyle? Do you have a sense on when the NRC is going to rule on your request for a hearing, or is there we just have no clue?
We don't know when it will come. I think that it may be that they're waiting on NRC staff to get this information and weigh in one way or another. I don't think they have to wait for that. So it's kind of anyone's guess.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. Steph Hoffman on behalf of the Department of Public Service. I've been asked in advance to walk through the events that are happening in the docket at the PUC between last meeting and all the way through January, just to talk about what to expect during this period where the panel will not be meeting. And I wanted to start with the one development that has happened since the last NDCAP meeting, which is that the Commission in letter announced on October 30th that they would be retaining their own consultant for the remainder of the proceeding in order to advise the Commission regarding the docket. And they've announced that consultant would be an advisory consultant, not a testifying expert witness. Essentially, this letter was brief, but essentially our understanding of that consultant would be to also review the sort of litany of discovery materials in this case, the financial information, assess the experts' review of that material, and help the Commission in their assessment as they go forward, because presumably on staff there they have individual experts that have financial expertise, but not necessarily nuclear decommissioning financial expertise. And so our understanding is that they would retain someone to aid in that review process. As a result of the announcement of the retention of that advisory consultant, the parties were asked to comment on that announcement after Entergy and North Star filed a response. And so today the responses for that were due. The department filed a response, and NEC and CLF's attorneys also filed a response to Entergy and North Star's request for essentially the entire question right now is just how will that expert function in this proceeding, and will that person be available for questioning and or discovery questions, so informal or formal questions at the proceeding, and if not, what role will they serve and how will that role work in relationship to the commission, which acts as a tribunal in a lot of ways, but also acts as an agency in other ways. And they have, the commission has statutory authority to retain such an expert, just like the department and other agencies in this proceeding have that right. And so this is sort of just a process of fleshing out how that will work in this proceeding and what parties will be able to ask questions or not of that person. And I don't know when we'll expect a response to these filings, but they were due today. Tomorrow, as Joe mentioned in his schedule, the petitioners are responding to a third set of discovery requests by all the parties except NEC, which NEC is on a slightly delayed timeline. And after we receive those responses, all the non-petitioners, including NEC, have until December 1st to file our surrebuttal testimony, which is the last set of testimony, from presumably the same set of witnesses that had filed initial rebuttal testimony in the case. So it's not a new set of people. It will be the same set of people, probably refining the arguments that they've been making throughout. And then there'll be discovery on that throughout December. So we'll get asked questions along with the other state agencies and intervening parties. And then that will all conclude at the end of the month of December, right before the holidays. And then there'll be the public hearing, presumably still in Vernon, although we haven't had confirmation of that. And then during the beginning of January, there may be another deposition period, like the one in early October, where all of those testifying witnesses could be asked by any party to come and submit themselves to questions from the other parties. And those notices will know if those depositions are taking place by the middle of next month in December. So there'll be an idea going into the holidays of whether those are taking place in January. And then we'll have a conference with the commission to set the hearing schedule up and order of witnesses, cross-examination periods and things like that. And we'll have a very good idea at the end of that status conference, which is on January 19th in Montpelier, how the hearing will kind of unfold. What we basically do during that conference is establish what witnesses will testify when, how long we assume they'll be cross-examined for. It's always a guess with attorneys, you never know, but give an estimate, and then we'll prepare for hearing the following week. And we will go through what is scheduled as 2 weeks of hearings with the witnesses that have already presented testimony. And with commission proceedings, unlike courtroom proceedings, there are no surprise witnesses or people that you bring only to that hearing process to testify. So all the testifying witnesses have already been introduced in some form or another at this point, and they are subject mostly to cross-examination during the hearing period. All the testimony they provided thus far is the testimony that would serve as direct testimony in a trial proceeding. And so there's not an additional time for them to kind of articulate what their point is. That's what this written process is that has been occurring for the last 6 months. Any questions?
I want to ask one quick thing. Does anyone else from the state have any update? And then we're going to go to questions. I know Tony doesn't, Bill doesn't. Okay. All right, now we will open up to panel questions for either staff or Kyle or Joe or Laura. Yeah. Joe, we have a question for you.
Joe, as I was coming in and hearing about the water management update, I noted that you hadn't anticipated the amount of water. And so my question, the amount of groundwater, my question is why? And what's to be learned from that, really?
Sure. So we certainly knew that the buildings that have subsurface structures go well into the groundwater table. But when we operate, those buildings are very warm. They have sump systems that process the water regularly. So we really, while we operated, didn't have an idea until we shut down the type of intrusion rates that we could have. So we have sumps that go into the ground. We have, systems that capture that water. And it was at that point we determined, the exact amount. So we knew that there was probably going to be some water that needed to be handled and processed, but we didn't have a magnitude. It would have been essentially an estimate at that point. The good news is that we had contingency in our budget, and we have very favorable disposal costs. Both of those are bounded by what the original budget was.
Okay, so can I just clarify? I think what you said was that when the plant stopped operating and the systems that you had in place were no longer operating, that's when this became
That's
apparent.
correct. When we operated, we would essentially capture all the water, process it, and reuse it in the plant.
Mhm.
Once we shut down, the building cooled down, all of that water became water that we would have to store or, in this case, dispose of.
Okay. Thank you.
Are you going to ask Joe a water question? Yeah. Hey, Joe, hold on one sec.
Thank you. All of this is fresh groundwater that's coming up into the building that's being disposed of, correct? I mean,
That's correct. All the groundwater monitoring wells that we have up gradient indicate that this is clean water coming into the building.
And do we have a sense of how much water it's been over? Yes,
623,000 gallons have been shipped to date.
of fresh water.
Of groundwater that's been mildly contaminated once it gets in contact
Once it gets
with
to the building.
with the building.
Had there
correct.
been any efforts, I mean, it's been going on now since closure. Had there been any efforts to try to divert that water so it could be used or saved or, instead of having to have a cost shipping it out and have it become contaminated? Was there any, sorry if I'm coming into this late, but was there any effort to try to divert that water?
Well, a couple of things. We have quite a bit of water stored at the site in our Taurus that is used to replenish water that's evaporated from the spent fuel pool. So we have an adequate supply of water that's used to replenish that type of water that has to be back to the spent fuel pool. This water would be something that we could use, but we looked at all different techniques, including putting in wells that would intercept the water,
Yeah.
but our hydrogeologist said that could create actually a more difficult situation because once you move the water around, you kind of create new pathways that are best addressed by just sealing up what we have right now. So as you can see from the slides, the efforts that we've been taking over the last couple of years have reduced the water, past 90% of the original intrusion rates. And that was deemed to be the more efficient way to minimize water coming in.
Can I just ask my colleague here on the panel, I mean, when a company uses that volume of water, are there additional costs, is a company charged for, sorry, I'm just trying to get a handle on it. It seems just like a lot of water is being wasted, fresh water. Water's a precious commodity. Water, some of the wells have run dry in recent years. I'm concerned about the level of water that's being lost. I'm just wondering if there's if a company comes and uses that volume of water, is that something that the state taxes or normally charges? I'm looking at you because I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure about the, from the state fees and stuff like that, but what I wanted to add to what Joe said is, I mean, we've looked at a bunch of different alternatives that we could use to deal with the water that's ingressing into the plant. And so diversion wells was one of those, which was what the question was asked originally. So that is an option that's still available to us. But what we looked at is what's the most feasible to reach a solution to minimize the ingress, and what's the cost of the solutions that we implemented. And what we're doing right now is the best balance of both of those. It's water that we could use in the plant if we needed it, but like Joe said, we already have over 800,000 gallons of water that's stored in the Taurus in the plant, so we really don't need it. So again, we look to balance both the best technical solutions and for the most economic solution to it.
Steve Skibnowski, representing Vernon. I think it's important also to note that this water, unlike some of the aquifers you might be familiar with elsewhere, would simply pass from where it is now into the river and head south to Long Island Sound. And it's, I know 600,000 gallons sounds like a lot of water, but you got to remember that the Vernon, that the Connecticut River and the Vernon Dam are passing millions of gallons of water daily, and this is really probably not even measurable in the amount of water that's heading south. So I don't think, as far as impact to either the town of Vernon and its water table, there's no impact because it's all downhill from any water usage in the town. And then once it gets to the river, it's heading south, and certainly, there's 625,000 gallons less of Connecticut River water in Long Island Sound, but I really don't think you could measure that very well either. So that would be my take on it. And that's true over 3 years. Right. Yeah.
So just to echo in from the Agency of Natural Resources, there is a statute in place for our groundwater. It's our groundwater protection rule and strategy, and the legislature passed a number of years ago making it a public trust issue. And it was mainly for bottled water companies who were withdrawing large quantities, many millions more than what we're talking about here. So I think in this case, I agree with the comment just made. That it really is an insignificant amount, but if there was really a water shortage and that was something that was used for drinking, we could look to the public trust part of the groundwater rule, but I don't think that really applies here.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the insight into that because it was troubling me. And I also want to thank Entergy for expediting the removal of the spent fuel from the pool into the casks and making that agreement to expedite with the state. It's extremely important, and I appreciate you doing that.
Oh, yeah. Laura.
Thanks. Just another follow-up with regard to just when will you stop having contaminated groundwater to truck out of there? When will you stop having contaminated groundwater to truck out of there?
Well, as I had mentioned, we've had the 90% reduction, but we continue to look at the areas that we've identified where the water is coming from, and if feasible, we'll continue to use techniques to seal those up. So we haven't ended it. We haven't declared victory. Our goal is to have no intrusion water. So I would say hopefully you'll be hearing continued decreases as we go forward, but we've come a long way, and it looks like the plans have been very successful up to this point.
So, Madam Chair, I just want to kind of follow up on this, push on this a little bit here. The groundwater I see here, you have it confined, as you said, to the turbine building. Is all of that building going away?
Well,
or is part of the rubblization?
Well, I guess it would be best for North Star to explain, their approach. But my understanding is they'll decontaminate that entire structure. They'll remove it to a minimum of 4 feet below grade, and then what's left would be filled with either native material or recycled material. I don't know their exact plans for the turbine building.
And so, at that point, does the water stop being contaminated?
They would
by the
have
structures under the 4 feet?
They would have to meet the cleanup standards for radiological for the site, and they'll remove whatever concrete that is necessary to meet that. So once they get below certain levels, the water would be coming into contact with something that would be, below the overall 15 millirem or 25 millirem standards that are either imposed by the NRC and being proposed by North Star for this project.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, Joe, can I ask you while you're there? I was writing and listening at the same time, which is not good because you miss things. You said it cost $3.25 million for shipping, and that includes the labor.
That's correct.
That's all inclusive.
The actual cost to to the disposal site
Yeah.
is about 2.6 million, and then about 600,000 for the labor costs over a 3-year period, roughly.
Now, did you say how much in the decommissioning cost estimate was allocated for water? I know you said that you had to use contingency money.
Right. So we have what we call a water processing budget. So it was clearly not designed just for intrusion water. It also would have eventually been designed to dispose of what's going to be left in the Taurus. That was around $9.7 million with contingency. So it was slightly less than that, and then has a 15% contingency, something like that. So I think it's around $8 million, 15% contingency, just under $10 million in the budget for water processing.
All right. And what you're saying is you're going to reach that 10 million.
No, I don't know, because again, we don't know once we start the project how much will be left in the Taurus, because we're evaporating, especially in the winter time, about 15,000 gallons a month.
Okay, because I thought I was when I was writing and listening, I thought that you were using the contingency funds already, but you're not.
No, I just talked about the fact that even though we didn't plan on 623,000 gallons, the contingency has covered that, and we probably will use less than the money budgeted because we have a favorable disposal rate for the water in the Taurus. So I'm kind of projecting a little bit what it all looks like. But at this point, what we've spent has been well within the budget and the contingency.
Thank you. Oh, Riley, hold on.
Yeah, I just had a brief question about this 200 to 300 gallons per day figure. I know that that's a significant reduction from the past. I'm just wondering whether we can expect that to continue to come down, or whether that is a temporary low due to factors that are unpredictable, like weather and amount of the water table levels and other things. I mean, is this a number that we expect to continue to see decline going forward?
Well, we'll have seasonal fluctuations as we would just as we have runoff, in the spring. So presumably it could change. So we try to keep it in a range. So right now we're fairly confident this 200 to 300 gallons per day is probably a good number. We've had it consistently now, I think, for the last 3 readings. And we can show that it's directly related to some recent sealing efforts that we've done. But certainly it could vary with seasonal changes. And if we find additional leaks and seal them up, hopefully it will actually lower. But to say that it'll be this way going forward would be, at this point, optimistic, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Does anyone on the panel have one last question before we move on? Does anyone on the phone have a question from the panel? Okay, thank you, Joe and Steph and Kyle. We might call on you later during our what are we going to talk about in the future segment if you're still here. So thank you. Next up, we're going to have a discussion on, or a conversation or an update, whatever you want to call it, from the state of New Hampshire. We weren't able to get anyone from Massachusetts, but we do have Bob Gustafson, who is on our panel and works for the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management in the state of New Hampshire, because one of the things that we realized is we really haven't asked our counterparts in our neighboring states, is there anything that they have concerns about in relationship to the decommissioning of the Vermont Yankee plant? It seems really obvious, but it's probably why we never asked them the question. So Bob is on the phone, and Bob, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. So what we're going to do is have Bob share with us his thoughts. And what I told him we would do is when we get to the question time and anyone has a question for Bob, we will say who we are, so it's not just these voices, so that he can actually know who's asking him the question. So Bob, I guess I'll throw it over to you. And we appreciate hearing what the state of New Hampshire is thinking in regards to the decommissioning.
Oh, thank you, Kate. I appreciate the opportunity. Basically, I've tried to talk to some of the people in the state that may or may not be thinking about what's going on in Vermont, plus the fact that we have been with the panel for a while and stuff. And the way our organization works, we deal with a lot of the town-based issues and stuff, and outages, the storm restoration and all that, besides doing, in my case, the radiological emergency preparedness activities for Seabrook and previously Vermont Yankee. One of the things that keeps reoccurring in discussions about Vermont Yankee and all that is it tends to be people are more concerned about impacts on the infrastructure, such as materials that are coming out and shipping over the highways and stuff, materials that may have to come in, heavy equipment as it moves, and those types of impacts. That seems to be the more prevalent theme. We have a field service organization that every community in the state has a representative from our field services group. And I have asked the people dealing with Cheshire County and stuff like that in the area where our county is to Vermont, the Vermont Yankee plant, if they have heard anything from their residents, from their clients as to potential issues or worries or concerns. And I have not heard anything back, but I told them to continue asking as the process moves along in case something comes about so that we could discuss it at the meetings. And that's basically where we're at right now. I think as the project moves along, as there's more activity, there may be a resurgence of interest in what may or may not be issues. But at this point in time, it's basically people are more worried about what's going to happen on the roads and the traffic and the equipment moving and fill in, debris out kind of thing. So that's basically all I've got.
Right. So just to summarize, Bob, this is Kate, is really what you're talking about now is infrastructure, your roads and... Correct.
Traffic, roads, the wear and tear on the roads plus the impact on traffic, on anything moving, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. That's all that we've heard so far. And in fact, even I think there was a John Tuttle that mentioned that at the last meeting, some materials and substances and delineations there are, if your stuff is moving off site, where's it going? I think they'd be concerned that it may be dumped somewhere in New Hampshire. But other than that, there really hasn't been any discussions that I'm aware of. Mm-hmm. But we're willing to keep an eye on it if anything comes about. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah. Does anyone on the panel have any questions for Bob? Oh yes, Steve.
Yes. Steve Skibnowski here, representing the town of Vernon. Bob, I just wanted to ask you, talking about infrastructure and roads, are you speaking of the ones in New Hampshire or over the whole region?
Well, I think it would be an impact for the whole region, but specifically, what it would do to the New Hampshire roads.
Okay.
But basically, anything, it's regional based, because if they're moving through Vermont, if they're moving through Massachusetts, if they're moving through New Hampshire, it'll be wear and tear on all of them. So.
Right, I understand. I was just trying, as you were talking about that, I was trying to envision passage of things from the plant through New Hampshire, and I just wasn't picking up on it, but I suppose there could be a situation. All right, thank you. That's all I had.
Great. Does anyone else on the panel have any more questions for Bob? Oh, yeah. Hold on 1 second. We've got one.
Okay.
It's okay. Hi, Bob. This is Lissa Weinman. I'm a citizen representative on the panel. I'm just reflecting back on a conversation I had a few months ago with Arnie Gunderson, who has not addressed this panel, but is a nuclear engineer who was in the employ of the state of Vermont in the past to consult on these issues. And we were talking about the potential for future groundwater contamination around the Vermont Yankee site. And he had said, if I thought there was contamination, I'd look in Hinsdale, at the wells in Hinsdale. And I wondered if the state of New Hampshire or any private enterprises across from the plant in Hinsdale had ever done any radiological testing of the wells.
Yeah, that I am not sure of. I can take and go back and see if I can find out. I can work with, try to get the DES and some of the other agencies to see if they have. But as of now, I am not aware of them doing any testing.
Thank you.
Does anyone else on the panel have any questions for Bob? All right. Thank you. Thank you, Bob.
Oh, my pleasure.
And I'm assuming you're going to stay on the line?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
You know, if you got a second, Kate, what I'd like to do is if people have further questions that they think of afterwards, they can always contact the agency I work for, and a message will get to me. If I can give them some phone numbers right now if you want, that they can call.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let me give you the first one. This is for the Homeland Security Emergency Management contact numbers. There's two of them. There's a 603-271-2231, and then there is an 800 number, which should be 1-800-852-3792. Those are general information contact numbers, so they could call and they could ask the question, and they could ask it to be routed to me and all that if they wanted.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Now we're going to move on to our next agenda item, which is David Andrews giving us the definition of industrial versus residential cleanup standards. And this agenda item came about because, I don't know if it was the last meeting or 2 meetings ago, they all sort of blend together. We had that, it was when Scott State was here, we had that conversation about what standards mean what, and we all realized, or a lot of us realized, we are still really confused. So David, oh, okay.
Sorry, David. But the right time, I think, is to ask this now. I might have missed it earlier, but is Massachusetts coming another time? We're just not participating? I haven't seen anyone from Massachusetts in a long time.
Yeah, and we're working on that. So we only listened to New Hampshire this evening because we have not completed the circle on finding someone from Massachusetts. Yeah. Yeah, we're not ignoring our neighboring state. We like them. So that's why David is here tonight, to hopefully go over and make it clear or clearer to us what the definition of this means. And there may be people on the panel that will add things to what David says. So that's how this has come about, because of the confusion a meeting or two ago. Are you ready?
Take a stab at this. So I'm David Andrews from the panel. We're going to try to talk about cleanup standards. As Kate said, 2 meetings ago, there was a lot of discussion where we started throwing out different terms. And I think a lot of us don't really have a firm basis of what those terms are. And if we don't know what we're talking about, then we're kind of flopping in the breeze. So hopefully this will provide some clarity here. Little of it is dry, I apologize, but it'll all come together. First part I'm going to talk about is radiological. This is not the non-radiological, this is just the radiological side of the conversation. This is the dry part, folks. There's 8 definitions from the NRC we need to talk about. These are all spelled out in 10 CFR 20.1003, which is definitions. Within most regulations, including the state regs, one of the most valuable places to go to is the definitions. You can see what the terms mean. Because the same term, different agencies can mean different things. So you really have to go to the definitions to understand. So the first, unrestricted area, means an area access to which is neither limited nor controlled by the licensee. So you can imagine there's also a restricted area, which is an area that is controlled or limited. Second one is residual radioactivity. Residual radioactivity means radioactivity in structures, materials, soils, groundwater, and other media at a site resulting from activities under the licensee's control. It includes radioactivity from all licensed and unlicensed sources used by the licensee, but excludes background radiation. It also includes radioactive materials remaining at the site as a result of routine or accidental releases of radioactive material at the site and previous burials at the site, even if those burials were made in accordance with the provisions of 10 CFR 20. Background radiation means radiation from cosmic sources, naturally occurring radioactive material, including radon, except as a decay product of source or special nuclear material, and global fallout as it exists in the environment from the testing of nuclear explosive devices or from past nuclear accidents such as Chernobyl that contribute to background radiation and are not under the control of the licensee. Background radiation does not include radiation from source, byproduct, or special nuclear materials regulated by the Commission. Then we have total effective dose equivalent, which is called TEDI. TEDI is a total dose that you receive. You have external dose, internal dose, add them together, you get total dose. Critical group. And these will all make sense here in a minute. Critical group means the group of individuals reasonably expected to receive the greatest exposure to residual radioactivity for any applicable set of circumstances. ALARA. We talk ALARA within nuclear power all the time. ALARA is an acronym which means as low as reasonably achievable. Means making every reasonable effort to maintain exposures to radiation as far below the dose limits in this part as is practical, consistent with the purpose for which the licensed activity is undertaken, taking into account the state of technology, the economics of improvements in relation to state of technology, the economics of improvements in relation to benefits to the public health and safety and other societal and socioeconomic considerations, and in relation to utilization of nuclear energy and licensed materials in the public interest. Difficult one for some people to get their heads around. And ALARA changes over time as technology changes and regulations change. Decommission. Decommission means to remove a facility or site safely from service and reduce residual radioactivity to a level that permits 1. The release of the property for unrestricted use and termination of the license, or 2. Release of the property under restricted conditions and termination of the license. And then we have distinguishable from background. That means that the detectable concentration of a radionuclide is statistically different from the background concentrations of that radionuclide in the vicinity of the site, or in the case of structures and similar material using adequate measurement technology, surveys, and statistical techniques. So why did I throw all that at you? Well, this is what it comes to. This is from the Code of Federal Regulations, the NRC rules, 10 CFR 20.1402. This is the radiological criteria for unrestricted use. And the key parts that we just discussed here, some are highlighted in red. A site will be considered acceptable for unrestricted use if the residual activity that is distinguishable from background radiation results in a TEDI to the average member of the critical group that does not exceed 25 millirem per year, including that from groundwater sources, drinking water, and the residual radioactivity has been reduced to levels that are as low as reasonably achievable, ALARA. Determination of the levels, which are ALARA, must take into account consideration of the detriments, such as deaths from transportation accidents, expected to potentially result from decontamination or waste disposal. Again, we're talking radiological, we're not talking non-radiological, and this is the criteria for unrestricted use. In addition, the state of Vermont has regulations that relate to radiological limits. The first, and you can see these on the web, the first is State of Vermont Department of Health Rule, Part 5, Chapter 3, Subchapter 1, Section 5-305 Standards. You can go right to healthyvermont.gov and scroll on down, you can find these, and the full text is there. The second is in the statutes, Title 18, Chapter 32, Ionizing and Non-Ionizing Radiation Control. And you'll note that a number of the definitions within those state regulations mirror or almost exactly mirror the federal definitions. That's radiological. Non-radiological. There's you've heard the phrase IROC thrown around. This is the Investigation and Remediation of Contaminated Property Rules. This is promulgated by the State of Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Environmental Conservation, Waste Management, and Prevention Division. The final adopted rule, this is now a rule within the state of Vermont, is effective July 27, 2017. It's not light reading. But it is actually kind of interesting reading. It's just not very light. It goes on for 55 pages. The purpose of the IROC rule is intended to protect the public health and its environment by establishing procedures and requirements for conducting investigations and corrective actions at properties where a release of hazardous materials has occurred. This includes procedures for identifying hazardous material contamination to the environmental media, including soil, groundwater, surface water, and air, as well as requirements for source treatment, removal, or containment, long-term monitoring, and institutional controls. This is the non-radiological side. Within the IROC rule, there are three tables in the back, three appendixes. The first is for soil screening values, the second is for vapor intrusion values, and the third is for sediment values. Here's an example of each of them. You can see the CAS number, the chemical abstract number for each of these individual chemicals. And you'll note there's an EPA regional screening level. These are the limits, and they're defined there. You see residential and industrial. And then Vermont also, for some of these, has a screening level. And if there is a state screening level, it's listed in the third column. And then there's also background soil concentrations that Vermont DEC has. That's the fourth and the fifth. So you'll see there's residential and industrial. Remember, we're talking restricted, unrestricted, that's radiological. We're talking residential, industrial, that's non-radiological. So this is the soil screenings value. This is the sediment values. And this is the vapor intrusion values. Now, for most of these, there's actually EPA screening levels. There are some chemicals which there aren't EPA screening levels, and there are a number of them which there aren't Vermont levels, but there are some that there are. So you really have to look at each individual one for it to make sense. So there's been some confusing comments that were thrown around in past meetings, and I'm hoping that we can kind of straighten it out. That the key, if there's a takeaway to get here, is that there is radiological and non-radiological, and let's keep the terms separate, otherwise we start getting really confused here. One comment was that non-restrictive is considered residential standards. Well, there's really nothing non-restricted. There's unrestricted. Unrestricted is an NRC term, which is a radiological term. Residential is an EPA Vermont A&R term, which is non-radiological. Okay, two separate areas. There's also stated the NRC does not define restricted use. Well, I gave you the unrestricted definition. There's a much longer, much larger definition for restricted use, and it has separate categories depending on the levels that you're dealing with, and that's 25 millirem per year, 100 millirem per year, and even 500 millirem per year for restricted use. So there are clear definitions for restricted use in the NRC. Third is in the IROC rule, we have standards for industrial, commercial, and residential. Well, there's standards for industrial and residential. The only reference to the word commercial in the IROC rule it's mentioned once, and it's in reference to zoning. Apples and oranges. Just want to make sure we don't confuse this with non-radiological standards and radiological standards. And the last slide I have here, which is a little bit busy, but we hear the discussions about 25 millirem per year or 15 millirem per year, or can we get it to 10 millirem per year? Can we get to 0 millirem per year? There needs to be some scale, some comparison there, so we understand what we're talking about in terms of total dose. The National Council of Radiation Protection, NCRP, issued their latest study on background radiation in the United States. It's called NCRP 160. It was put out, I believe, in 2009, and its last study looked at 2006 aggregate dose rates across the United States. That was an update from, I believe it was NCRP 89, which was a good 10 or 15 years before. The previous one, you'd heard the number thrown around, it was around 325 millirem per year is what the average American receives for background dose. The newest one, and I say new, this number is from 2006, so we're 11 years old, is putting the figure closer to 625 millirem per year. This chart is from NCRP Report 160, and it breaks down exactly where the dose comes from. And you can see the blue area is the largest increase from what we had in the past, and that's medical. Logically, 25 years ago, there wasn't a lot of medical exposure. But now between nuclear medicine, CT scans, interventional fluoroscopy, and other radiography and fluoroscopic procedures, that's now accounting for almost 300 millirem. On the background side, the green side, you see the largest part there, 37%, is from radon and thoron. So that's, again, an aggregate from the looking across the country. If you're in a part of the country that has large radon concentrations compared to the norm, such as Vermont, that number will be even higher. So this is 625 millirem total per year for perspective that we're talking about 15 to 10 to 20 MR. So I hope that provides a little bit of clarity here between radiological and non-radiological standards.
And this, David, you can say yes if I got this right. This all came about because we were talking about the site restoration standards that the Public Utilities Commission is going to approve or work out with North Star. And that's why we got all confused, because what's residential versus what's industrial.
That's right.
And
We started throwing these terms around. Is restricted considered residential? Is what's the dose to the farmer and so on? These are two separate sets of standards.
Yeah. And that's what the Public Utility Commission is only dealing with non-radiological site restoration standards.
I believe so.
We probably even confuse some more people, but we tried. That was an attempt to not confuse people. Laura looks confused. Do you want to ask David a question?
Sure. Hi, David.
Hi.
Do we know if any former nuclear power facility has ever been released for residential use? I don't think so.
I have no idea.
I just don't think that this site will ever be released to residential use. Does anyone else think so? I mean, does Entergy think so? No. I mean, let's face it. Entergy agreed with Governor Shumlin to try to adhere to a residential standard, knowing that the federal government does not compel them to do so.
Well, let me ask you a question in exchange here. You used the term residential standard, so you're talking about the non-radiological residuals on the site, or you're talking about the radioactive residuals on site?
I'm talking about the end use being residential, taking into account either definition.
Okay, and that's an important point here is when we're talking residential standards, we're talking about non-radioactive contaminants. If we're talking about putting a residence
unrestricted
on there,
use, I'm talking about unrestricted use and residential standards.
thank you, that's exactly where I'm going at. I believe what you're saying is if there is to be no prohibitions whatsoever on the property, then we would have to release it for unrestricted use and residential use.
Yes.
Two separate.
Yes.
Yeah.
I guess I just don't understand why we're even talking about this, because the likelihood that it's ever going to reach that standard seems like nobody, including Entergy, thinks it's going to happen.
I certainly won't debate that. My concern was that the two categories were being interspersed and confused and.
Okay.
I don't think the intent of this conversation was for us to decide whether we think residential or unrestricted or whatever is the correct way. It was just making sure that we were all on the same page where the definitions of the terms were concerned. Does that make sense? That's what we're talking about it right now. Oh, Steve.
Yes, Steve Skibniowski, representing the town of Vernon. I think it's important to point out here that much of our riverfront property in Vernon is not, in fact, currently used for residential, nor has it been, at least since post-Columbian times. That particular area has been seen as was used as farmland. It wasn't the best in town, but it was farmed for many years. There was a hunting camp down on the edge of the water, but only seasonal in use. People tended to live up near the road, and I believe the current thinking in the town of Vernon, as far as its planning commission goes, and I would hope that the planning commission is representing the interests of the townspeople, that in fact that site would be much better for the town of Vernon and Windham County if it were developed into, or if it were returned to some kind of productive, but non-residential, but productive kind of things, such as another power plant or whatever. I do believe that from my own knowledge of radiation and contamination and non-radioactive contamination, that that site would be restorable. I have great confidence in that, and I don't see that there's anything really impeding that at this point. And I'm a 68-year resident of Vernon, you might say. Thank you. Thank you. I don't have any more.
Yes, Jim.
David, is this, I just want to, tell me if you think I'm missing something here, that suppose the cleanup were proceeding and you got to 25 milliram. ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable, still applies.
Yes.
So if it's determined reasonable to go beyond that to something that potentially could get to unrestricted use, even though that were not a stated goal, the principle of ALARA would compel the process to continue until you got as low as reasonable achievable, whether that was 25 or 5 or 10 or...
Yes, but I think that might be cart and horse, because you're following ALARA principles at the very beginning of your decommissioning process in order to drive your end result. It's not that you get so far, you check your levels, and then...
Right, and that's what I'm saying, is that if I'm not advocating that we did, but if we were to debate and say we think a restricted use to some industrial level was appropriate, ALARA could still take it further. I mean, you're going to go as low as reasonably achievable, and that's going to be based on the technology at the time and processes that are accepted at the time, et cetera. Am I right?
That's a true statement, but I think that Entergy already stated their intention was to clear the site for unrestricted use.
Right. So I guess I'm agreeing with the people saying this. We could not be in a position of choosing one or the other. You've got to go where you go with it.
Yes.
Right.
And take it a step farther is the goal is not to get to 25 millirounds.
No, it's to go as low as reasonably achievable.
That's right.
And that could be much less than 25.
You bet.
But it must be at least 25.
To be defined as unrestricted use.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Jim, just in response to your comment on ALARA, there's 5 words in there: as low as reasonably achievable. It's not as low as technologically capable, it's reasonably achievable. And reasonable is a non-defined term. It's in the eye of the assessor, if you will.
But everything I've read about it says reasonably includes technology available. If some new technology came up, the same level of effort would bring you to a lower point, then that's what's reasonable now. That could easily happen. Unless I have a lot more faith in technology than you do.
Okay, this probably won't be the last time we have this conversation.
Just as a point of clarification.
Yeah, wait, David.
Just as a point of clarification, and again, sorry, I'm new to the panel, so maybe I haven't read all the documents. I'm trying. The agreement that Entergy made with the state was to restore to 25 or below, right? Wasn't that the agreement? To release for unrestricted use. That was the agreement that was made with Entergy and the Shumlin administration. Wasn't that correct? Where was that? There was a level that was for unrestricted use that was agreed to. Am I correct?
I don't know if it was agreed to with Governor Shumlin at that time. I do believe we agreed to achieve unrestricted use. And like David said, by definition, that is less than or equal to 25 millirem per year.
But odds are, you know, that what you had just said, though, is that we don't really reasonably expect that we'll actually get to that. And that the federal government doesn't compel Entergy to meet that standard. That was just an agreement with the state, right?
I don't know the background on that, Lisa, so I can't comment on that.
Does anybody else know?
I don't think any of us want to say, speak to something we don't know the answer to. So maybe we can have that come up at another meeting. Do you know what I mean? We don't want to.
It just seems like an important point since we're talking about this.
Yeah.
If it's something that
Yeah.
we don't expect to happen, then why are we wasting time discussing it at all?
Yeah.
Let's see if
Okay, if I understood the question, you know, all of the plants that have been decommissioned in New England have achieved much less than 25 millirem per year. So it's a goal that we've committed to. All the sites that have been decommissioned, I believe, have been decommissioned for unrestricted use. So it's very achievable. It's what I think North Star is committed to in their proposal, and it's what we've committed to if we go to a safe store scenario. So. And I think it's been talked about, you know, Yankee Row is 10 millirem, Connecticut was somewhere between 13 and 19, and I think Maine was 14. So they all achieve below the 25 millirem. So it's very achievable.
Thank you, Joe. Now we're going to move on. Tony is going to give us a quick update on the spent fuel transportation plans. Tony's involved in a rail. You can talk about what you're involved in. But we just thought it would be a good time to do a really quick run through on what some of the plans are, even though it's probably, we don't know when anything's going to actually move.
Yeah, okay, and bear with me a little bit because I'm kind of multitasking here. And don't panic. Yes, each of these presentations have 13 slides. I'm not going to get into all of the details on every slide, but I hope anyone from the public who's interested or the panel will review the slides at some point. And if you have questions, feel free to contact me later. Key point on both of these presentations is that right now, these presentations are for information only.
Hey, Tony. First, you're just going to do the transportation one, and then we're going to take a break, and I'm going to explain why we're doing the other one, the spent fuel.
Okay.
So
I didn't see a break in the agenda.
Well, I want you. Yeah, I don't want you to go into the history of the spent fuel storage until.
No. We'll have to pull up another presentation, so I'll take a minute or two.
Okay.
Okay. So anything that you talk about with spent nuclear fuel. On a national scale does work back to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982. And that covers quite a bit of ground, but it does talk a little bit about the responsibilities for moving spent nuclear fuel from really any site in the country. And that responsibility falls to the Department of Energy. Oh, pardon me. That falls to the Department of Energy. They are responsible for planning the shipping. They take possession of the spent fuel as soon as it leaves the site. And one other requirement in NWPA with all of this is that for planning purposes, the DOE is required to consult with both state governments and tribal governments. Okay, so. And while there isn't a national repository available right now, and there's been some debate on, well, what is the best path forward, one thing that most sides have agreed with is that this planning does need to continue right now. So the Department of Energy, through NWPA, has the lead in addressing the planning, but you also get other agencies involved, Department of Transportation agencies such as the Federal Railroad Administration, and believe it or not, the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, which is actually used to address hazardous material transportation, regardless of whether it's rail, pipeline, or whatever. Also with this, we do get the NRC involved because they will be the regulator. And all of this comes together in what is known as the National Transportation Stakeholders Forum, which is where the consultation between these federal agencies, state and tribal governments actually takes place. So just a little bit about NTSF brings these agencies together. The planning, as far as moving spent nuclear fuel goes, right now, since we don't have a facility available, we look to move the fuel to really someplace in the center of the country, what is called a neutral transportation center. And there's several reasons for this. The major one is that with the way the transportation is likely to go, if you can get the fuel to the center of the country, then you can move it to wherever it needs to go or wherever the repository will be established. The potential shipping methods that are discussed are railroads, highways, and barge, or a combination of those. And as Kate alluded to earlier, I do represent the state at NTSF related meetings. Okay, and as far as what the planning does right now, we look at a number of other radioactive material and hazmat shipments that are occurring right now, and we try to take that experience and apply it to spent nuclear fuel transportation. A lot of that involves developing and updating inspection requirements, safety requirements, say for highway, for rail, and just try to anticipate what we will need when commercial spent fuel transportation actually begins. With that, one of the things that that the NTSF realized it needed to do was to develop a planning tool that could be shared really with a wide variety of government officials and bring together quite a bit of information. So that particular tool is something that I've been involved with really debugging at this point. And that tool is called the Stakeholder Tool for Assessing Radioactive Transportation, or START for short. The tool is actually maintained by Idaho National Laboratory, and users, if you have an email address that ends in .gov, right now it is possible for you to actually see and try to use this tool. If you have connection with the NTSF, of course they'll let you use it. If you're another interested state official, tribal government official, they may want some justification on your need, but they're starting to make this available more to people outside NTSF. So the reason for START is that basically when shipments begin, realize they're likely going to occur by rail. Railroad companies have private infrastructure. They have their own means for determining routing. They don't have to share how that's done. However, when you want to talk about moving this stuff, you really have to have some idea of, well, what's your route going to be? So what Idaho National Laboratory started to do was put together a lot of database information and come up with a tool that showed rail routes, showed highway routes, showed barge routes that could give you an idea, well, okay, starting from an origin, I mean, you can pretty much designate anywhere in the United States as your origin, and to a destination, and again, you can designate anywhere in the United States as a destination. What are your routes available? And so, needless to say, the tool brings in a lot of information. It brings in population information. It identifies where there's emergency personnel available, hospitals, the whole 9 yards. It's quite a bit of information. that's brought together. And this is just a picture. One thing that START really does is it provides pictures more than anything else. So if you're, as a START user, say if you're curious, well, what fire departments are available in a region, you can have START bring up a picture like that. And I apologize for the resolution on this. It's what I could get available on short notice. We can also do things such as like hospital beds, same thing. And we can pretty much do this with just about anything that has been factored into START so far. So what I've been working on, and this is through the NTSF's Rail Routing Working Group, we've been assessing, well, right now, how good is START? And right now, we think it has the capabilities that it needs right now. And the reason we believe that is a couple of months ago, in mid-August, the working group sat down with a number of railroad representatives, and we took some hypothetical routes. Basically, everyone in the working group who volunteered for this, and I was one of the volunteers, we have a nuclear power plant that we're interested in moving fuel off-site. So we chose a nuclear power plant, and then we chose a central United States location. It was typically Kansas City or St. Louis. But in any case, we used START to come up with, well, since we're talking about rail more than anything else, we came up with potential rail routes. And then we discussed those rail routes with representatives from BNSF Railways, Union Pacific, CSX, and a few other railways as well, to see, given the same question, what would the individual railroads come up with using their proprietary software? And the good news is we came up with effectively the same routes. Where there were differences, it was because there's some operational information that's proprietary to the railroads that we simply didn't have access to. For example, one of the routes, it was actually for, yes, it's for ANO2, if I remember correctly. But it was ANO2 to Kansas City was the route. And the rail that was chosen, at least one segment of it, whichever railroad was involved there, pointed out, they said, well, you're trying to go south to north on that route. We only send traffic north to south on that. We have another route that we use. It's just one of our operational considerations. We find this works better. So we had minor differences because of things like that, but generally the hypothetical routes, there are a total of 8, pretty much what START came up with is extremely close to what the railroads would have decided as well. So based on that, we're fairly confident that the START tool is now ready to be opened up for discussion with other planning officials, and we can continue a conversation from there. The last couple of slides I have here, these are more just pictures, but I just wanted to throw this up. This is the route that I had come up with for Vermont Yankee to St. Louis. What is included on here, all of the red dots represent where there are first responders who have been trained in what is called the Technical Emergency Planning Program, which is a Department of Energy program that allows first responders to learn how to address a radiological incident from a rail car or highway transportation. So what we see in this particular picture is that, well, there's, there are areas where there are quite a few first responders trained, and then there are areas where there aren't. So this is something that would have to be discussed with local first responders and local planners. So that's pretty much what I have on transportation right now, and I don't know if we want to entertain questions or just go to a break and come back with the second one.
We're not taking a break. I wanted to take a break between your things so I could explain what the next
Oh,
thing
sure.
is, so no one's
Okay.
moving, don't move anybody. What we've asked Tony to talk about next is the history and options for spent fuel storage. And this came up because of a request from Lissa. And we're not going to have a big discussion about this tonight. We just wanted Tony to set the stage in like 10 minutes of what's happening. And then what it's been on our calendar or radar for over, I don't know, a year and a half now to try to get DOE to come up here, but that's a long, complicated story. So we can, and the next item on the agenda is to talk about what we want to talk about next year in more depth. And I'm assuming this is going to be one of the things, but so we've asked Tony to give a little brief. Here's where things stand at this particular moment. So that's why this is on the agenda.
Okay, so again, the reminder, this is for information only. It does not represent policy of federal agencies or state agencies. Come on. Okay, Solange, can you advance it? Okay, thank you. I think the battery has just gone in the advancer. Okay, so a little bit briefly about where we came from with spent fuel management. Realize that the model that the nuclear power industry was using originally is somewhat different than what we have in place today. The original idea was that nuclear power plants would operate for about a year and then shut down and refuel. And with that refuel, most or all of the spent fuel would be removed, placed in the spent fuel pool for about 5 years, and then an agency, first the Atomic Energy Commission, and later the Department of Energy would come and take the fuel. And the original plan was that there was going to be some reprocessing of the fuel. Basically, as you conduct fission, you do get some additional fission, you get some additional fissile material in there that you could use later. So the plan was, let's extract that and try to minimize our waste that way. That second step, that the reprocessing, the pickups from AEC or DOE, that never really happened on a large scale. Okay, so next slide. One of the big changes during the Carter administration in the late 1970s, concerns came up that this reprocessing of fuel could potentially give someone who had a commercial nuclear program the ability to build an atomic weapon. So for non-proliferation concerns, the idea of reprocessing fuel was just taken off the table. So that left the only option with spent fuel disposal and storage. So with that, there were some efforts in the 70s of, well, what do we do? Things really didn't get organized until the early 1980s, 1982, as the National Waste Policy Act came to be. And what eventually the industry was directed to do was, well, let's minimize the amount of spent fuel that we have as much as possible, and let's make the the on-site storage as robust as we can. So what we had was longer times between refueling. Rather than a year, now we have, say, 18 months to 24 months. You have fuel assemblies that are used 2 and 3 times in what's called a fuel cycle. In other words, between those refuelings. So overall, you'll be using less fuel. And then the industry developed advanced spent fuel storage strategies so you could get more spent fuel into the pools. And this eventually led to the development of dry cask storage systems because we realized we couldn't keep everything in fuel pools forever. Let's try this one more time. Okay, it did advance. Okay, terrific. So, Nuclear Waste Policy Act was put together in 1982 and it was passed. And this was an attempt to put science together with some legislation. And what it called for was the founding of a national nuclear radioactive waste disposal facility. Originally, there were 10 candidate sites. These were identified in NWPA itself. the two most famous ones, Yucca Mountain was discussed quite a bit from the very beginning. The Hanford National Laboratory, which has done a lot of nuclear weapons research, was another candidate site. There are other sites that weren't discussed much, but they were in the original version of NWPA. What was supposed to happen was the DOE was supposed to evaluate these sites, come up with 3 finalists by the mid-1980s, and then the President of the United States was supposed to select one from those 3. That didn't happen. Through lobbying efforts and through additional amendments to the legislation, basically the other 9 candidate sites were eliminated from consideration. So ultimately, by the end of the 1980s, the only legal site to dispose of spent nuclear fuel is the Yucca Mountain site. And that's really where we are now as far as that goes. So more recently, what's been happening with Yucca Mountain? As I said, NWPA calls for Yucca Mountain to be the repository. There was a repository supposed to open by January 1998. That didn't happen. The process did move forward rather slowly. Eventually, Department of Energy did file for the NRC license to construct and operate a Yucca Mountain facility. That occurred in 2008. The license submittal had quite a few contentions and quite a few arguments back and forth. Eventually, in March 2010, the DOE requested to withdraw the application, and this was because the Obama administration had made the decision that the Yucca Mountain facility, because of resistance from Nevada and from other interveners, simply was not workable. Eventually, the proceeding was suspended. There were some court cases involved that pretty much ordered the NRC to proceed with the licensing to particular points. So in January of 2015, the safety evaluation report was issued, and the following year, the environmental assessment was issued. Now, most recently, with the Trump administration coming in, the Trump administration has called for a restart of licensing efforts. They've also called for what is called robust consolidated interim storage. This is where things get a little entertaining now. The House budget proposals for Department of Energy efforts in this area, and I'm going to read this from the slide because it gets confusing in my mind as well. The House is calling for Yucca Mountain licensing, but no consolidated interim storage. And then the Senate, there's quite a few things running through the Senate right now, but right now the U.S. Senate Energy and Water Appropriations Subcommittee approved funding for pilot consolidated interim storage, but no funding for Yucca Mountain. So we have, and there's a number of variations on this, but basically we have, three major branches of government, each proposing something different. Right now, Department of Energy is saying, well, look, guys, we don't have a clear direction on what you want us to do. So right now, we're waiting for this to get resolved, which is why I'm making this presentation rather than Department of Energy right now. Okay. So anyway, as I've noted, DOE is responsible for taking the spent fuel, shipping the spent fuel. Until that time, it's the individual plant owners are responsible for safely storing the spent fuel on site. This again comes from NWPA. However, because there was a missed deadline in 1998, the individual nuclear utilities are able to pursue damages either in a settlement or through other litigation and do recover damages for what they have spent on storing spent nuclear fuel that should have been taken away beginning in 1998. So this just gives you a picture of what the numbers are like. We're talking about $8 to $10 million a year annually per site to store spent nuclear fuel. And overall, that translates to about $500 million paid out. Actually, it comes from the Treasury Judgment Fund rather than touching any funds that was set up by the Nuclear Waste Policy Act to eventually process and store fuel at a national repository. Okay, so where are we? Yeah. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about the options right now. The only option currently available is on-site spent nuclear fuel storage. Your choices there are spent fuel pool or dry cask storage systems. Spent fuel pool, you typically need 4 to 5 years. There are some filings before the NRC right now to shorten that time frame, which actually goes back, David, to your question earlier that's related to that. Dry cask storage, there are a number of vendors out there that do dry cask storage systems. Holtec is used at the Vermont Yankee site. There's also NAC International, which provides a very similar product. Areva has bought out a system that was called New Homes, which actually does horizontal fuel storage and is a somewhat different system. Storage options, depending on what your site is like, you can either store this above ground or below ground. The below ground option was ruled out at Vermont Yankee because of water table concerns. So where do we go from here? Well, as the Trump administration has proposed, what could happen is the Yucca Mountain licensing activities could restart. If that occurs, before construction and the opening of the facility could begin, the licensing efforts would need to conclude. The NRC is expecting that to take about 3 to 5 years, assuming that there's no other license contention filed, and they're anticipating that someone somewhere will find a contention to file, and that may extend that. Right now, and I asked the Department of Energy for a specific date, and they said, well, right now there's no consensus. Back in 2013, the Blue Ribbon Commission and some of the efforts that the Obama administration had set forward had indicated that 2048 was the likely date when Yucca Mountain would be available. Now there are people at Department of Energy saying, well, we may be able to get that sooner. Someone, I was not told who, has indicated that 2028 is possible, but most people think that's very optimistic, to say the least. What you could also do is look for a new geological repository. For any of you who remember the consent-based siting efforts, that was the beginning of that. That has been suspended for now. Maybe it'll start up again, who knows? The other options are NWPA does allow for consolidated interim storage until long-term storage is available. There are currently 2 proposed consolidated interim storage facilities not available, but proposed and are being evaluated by the NRC right now. There's also another type of a facility called monitored retrievable storage. And as I looked at the information on that, I don't see a lot of difference between that and CIS. Right now, though, no one has proposed MRS at all, monitored retrievable storage. So at this point, it's really not an option. There could be other options if the United States were to come back and say, okay, well, let's reprocess some of this fuel. So what is CIS? Dry cask storage, you can think of it as dry cask storage on a larger scale, but a consolidated facility has to accommodate a variety of dry cask storage systems. So it's not just simply pads like what we have at Vermont Yankee right now. Conceivably, it will be multiple paths. It will be multiple storage systems. And what this will allow the facilities that are currently storing spent nuclear fuel to do is, if these become active, the fuel could be shipped from, say, Vermont Yankee or any shutdown site, and these sites could then fully decommission. The earliest possible date for consolidated interim storage, and the DOE keeps stating that this is still the target, is 2025. Now, whether anything from this current impasse in the budget will affect that date, it's hard to judge right now. There are two proposals. One is by waste control specialists. It would be in Andrews County, Texas. The other proposal is from Holtec and what's called the Eddie Lee Alliance, that is in New Mexico and is just over the border from WCS in Texas. Just a little bit of information on the WCS facility. Right now, it's proposing storage for only Areva and New Homes, Areva New Homes and NAC International types of systems. So Holtec systems right now are not in the proposal. It would be open in 8 phases. The first phase would hold about 5,000 metric tons of heavy metal, in other words, uranium, which, rough estimate, that's about 7 times the fuel, spent fuel inventory at Vermont Yankee. That's a very rough estimate. The first phase of it would be available by 2025 by the current schedule. The NRC has begun review on this. This particular proposal made it through its acceptance review, which means now the NRC is doing, or was doing, the more detailed technical review. However, early this year, WCS requested that the review proceedings be suspended because right now WCS has some financial difficulties. The Holtec proposal, right now, the Holtec proposal would take high storm stored fuel. In other words, the type of fuel storage that is at Vermont Yankee. This, from what you can see, if you compare the two proposals, this is actually a larger facility. And this is one, the first phase of it, again, plans to be available by 2025. Would store initially two 10 by 10 arrays, so basically 200 dry casks. It could expand to as many as 4,000 under the current proposal. This is being reviewed by the NRC. It is still in its acceptance review phase. The NRC has asked for additional information to complete the acceptance review. The more detailed technical review and the environmental assessment would still need to be done on this as well. And that's what I have on this right now, just to kind of bring us up to where we are.
Thank you so much, Tony. And again, we're not going to have a discussion about this tonight because when we do, we want to have other people in the room that can actually answer some of the questions that, I mean, Tony has done great. He got help from the Department of Energy, what they would give him. But our goal would be to have other people in the room that we could have more of a robust conversation. But we appreciate the overview. Okay. So thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
Next up is a discussion on what we're going to talk about in 2018. This is not the only time we talk about what we want to talk about as agendas come up. A lot of the way things happen is based on the current events. If something comes up and it's an immediate thing we need to talk about, we talk about it. But what we like to do at any given moment throughout the year is to brainstorm with each other what are the issues that you would like to talk about. And we have people from the state here, and we have obviously Joe from Entergy here. If there are certain things happening at a certain time that would make sense for us to talk about something, we'd like to do do it that way too. So there's a lot of ways that we put our agendas together. There is a method to the madness. So when you show up at a meeting, there has been thought put into it, believe it or not. Sometimes it might not appear that way. So I want to open up first up to the panel, and Laura, I'm going to go with you first on any suggestions or what we should be talking about.
So, new member, appreciate always hearing from Entergy, kind of an update on status. I appreciate hearing from the state about what's going on at the beginning of every meeting. I would like to hear from Vernon. I would like to hear from Vernon.
Oh, Vernon, yes.
I would like to add them as one of our regular updates at every meeting. Where they're at in terms of their preparations, what they're working on, any challenges that they're having. I think that's really important for us, since neither the state or Entergy will be the long-term holders of whatever is left here. So.
And we have representatives from Vernon on our panel, so hopefully that's not a hard thing to ask. So, David.
We had spoken before about inviting Holtec in to talk specifically about their interim storage facility and how it relates to Vermont Yankee. In addition to that, I'd like to invite our representatives from our congressional delegations to come in and talk about spent nuclear fuel disposal and the delays and what they have to say about it. Mm-hmm. Since this really isn't we're going to get this fuel out pretty soon. It's going to be sitting on that pad, and moving it off-site is not, we've discussed this before, it's not really a state issue. It's not an Entergy issue. It's a federal government issue. So we really should ask them why the delay.
Great. And as I said, we've had, Tony and I have DOE on the list. It's like literally been 2 years or something. So is there anybody else? David?
Well, I just want to repeat what you mentioned earlier, Massachusetts. We've really got to get them up here to talk with us and encourage them to be, send an active member to the panel.
Steve Skibniowski, representing the town of Vernon. I do believe that we've had some input from, for instance, the Vernon Planning Commission, and I certainly have provided information and raised some issues and responded to certain things, which I will continue to do. But certainly we could probably provide more information. Right now, the town of Vernon is dealing with changes. You can imagine economic changes as a result of the current state of the or status of the plant site, and but we're hopeful that things are going to be going forward, and certainly sharing that with you all would be something we'd like to do. And we thank you for stating that that our opinion is at least something you'd want to hear.
David.
One of the things that has dropped out of the Entergy report is workforce updates in term, not so much in, well, it's always been framed in terms of the number of people and the staffing level and whatever. I would really like to get some updates on the people no longer with Entergy. Have they landed on their feet? And has Entergy helped them do that? And I have expressed earlier that in terms of David's interest of the organized staff members at the plant, if there are issues, concerns that this panel ought to look at, I certainly would hope that we would make time to hear them.
So with David's excellent suggestion, triggering a light bulb, this David, with regard to our federal delegation, we have a situation right now. So when there is a nuclear power plant closure, it is not actually treated in the way that, say, a base closure is treated. And I know that our federal delegation has been doing some work on that, but I think if we have them coming here, I think understanding how their efforts are going would be important. There's work here that will be going on for many, many years, and working for an agency that has done some work around economic development, we've been advised that, and the timeline's over where you qualify. So, be
Good
to hear that.
suggestion. And I do want to say that we give Haley Perro, she's here from Senator Sanders' office, and the congressional delegation has been really good. Haley's pretty much always here, and then George Twigg and Tom Barry from Leahy and Welch's office have always been, are here too, and they've always been really responsive, so I'm sure it's easy for us to get them on the agenda. And Haley's here, so she knows exactly what we want to talk about. Does anyone else on the panel? And again, this is not the only time we can have this conversation. We have it quite often, and I know we've heard from Burns and McDonnell and Geosyntec, Riva, yeah, and then we're going to have WCS has agreed to come up, the third partner to North Star, so we have them sometime coming up in 2018. And David.
And I would like to make sure that we stay up to date on the PUC.
Yeah, and that's why I'm glad that Steph is here. And obviously, it appears, I don't know, Steph, if you have an idea, all the hearings and everything will be through the end of January. Is there any kind of idea of maybe when a decision will come through? Or, again, I know you don't have a crystal ball. We always put Steph on the spot.
March 22nd, no. So there'll be a briefing period that happens after the technical hearings conclude, the evidentiary hearings conclude. I imagine that period will be through a good chunk of February. The joint petitioners originally requested of the commission that they attempt to issue a decision by the end of March. Although the proceeding schedule has changed twice since the petition's original schedule was set in pretty substantial ways, including the approximately 3 months of discovery delays. So assuming briefing concludes at the end of February, I can't imagine a month turnaround on this docket, but I wouldn't bet on it, but I think we have a better chance of knowing by the beginning of summer.
Okay. Thank you.
End of May.
There's a lot to look forward to. Yeah. And I think in some ways, current events also, as I said in the beginning, sometimes drive the agenda. And obviously, if the PUC and NRC come down with a ruling, it can significantly change what we're going to be talking about, in addition to all these other issues that people want to talk about. So is there anyone on the panel that wants to weigh in any way? Lisa.
I know, it's kind of tough. So I think that it would be great to press the NRC to come as soon as possible and tell us how much of perimeter they're going to require around the spent fuel storage units and release for potential redevelopment. That's a question that hasn't been answered, and I don't think they're really keen to answer unless we start pressuring them to answer that question. I'd like to know a little bit more about hardened on-site storage. And I would specifically like to potentially invite a representative from the Union of Concerned Scientists. There's been apparently over 300 groups nationwide that have talked about that as a viable option. And I'd like to hear more about that, particularly since, as we just heard, the future of consolidated or any other type of storage is really fully in question, and we can't really count on that. So we need to know what our options are, particularly since this panel has already taken a public position supporting consolidated interim storage. Without any discussion, I think it's imperative that we understand what other options are out there, even though they're not sort of in the mainstream thinking. I think we need to explore those. And I think the Union of Concerned Scientists is a group that is very mainstream and has done a lot of examination of these issues, and it behooves us to hear from them, because they do have a neutral perspective on the issue. I also would concur with Laura that there is legislation pending that would allow localities like ours to receive federal compensation for hosting the nuclear waste. I think we need to hear from potentially the mayor of Zion, who has been a real strong national proponent for that and has been working on the federal legislation, and I think is amenable to coming and traveling and talking to communities like ours in order to get some buy-in for that, the need for legislation that would give communities like the Vernon and the larger Windham County that type of compensation potentially in the future for the years that we will be hosting this nuclear waste. I would like to get some perspectives from what they're doing overseas, particularly in France and Germany, as relating to reprocessing and their modes of waste storage and the decisions that they've made regarding dealing with their nuclear waste, because I think they've been dealing with it a little bit more effectively than we have here in the United States, and so we should potentially reach out, and I would be happy to do that, to try to figure out if there's any sources there that we could bring in to get a European perspective on how they deal with these matters. I understand the history of reprocessing in France has not been rosy, and I'd like to try to understand that a little bit more. And also, I think it would be important, I forget his name, maybe Clay Turnbull might remember, because I know that Ray Shaddis presented with him over in Russia recently, but the name of the gentleman who was the former head of, anyway, it doesn't matter, but Mike Meisner was the former head of what plant? Yeah, some of the heads of the other Yankees that closed, to get their perspectives on what we should be looking at. I don't know if the panel has heard from any of those leaders before, but they're nuclear engineers. They've been through the process. It'd be good to just pick their brain and hear from them in the year ahead. And that was. I also think it's a shame that we haven't ever heard from Arnie Gunderson. He is a noted expert, and I know that Entergy has had issues, recently with him, but he is a nuclear engineer, and he has a wealth of experience. He has worked for the state, and it would be interesting just to bring him in for a 15-minute presentation to hear what he thinks we should be looking at. And that's it.
Thank you. Does anyone else on the panel have anything they want to add? All right, now I want to ask anyone from the public if you have any suggestions about what the panel should be talking about as we move forward. Yes. And for the record, if you could tell us who you are and where you are from. And I ask that of everybody who gets up. Thanks.
Yes, hi, I'm Skylar Gould. I'm with New England Coalition. I just wanted to give a little encouraging perspective on the notion of hardened on-site storage. When you think about the enormous, not to mention the regulatory hurdles that need to be gone through in order to create a consolidated interim storage, when you think of the enormous costs that are going to have to go into improving the infrastructure in this country to handle upwards of 100,000 tons of, that's the nuclear waste, not to mention the containers which have not even been designed yet. It's considerably easier and cheaper to store this waste, not necessarily immediately on site, but 200 feet from the Connecticut River may not be the best place, but somewhere in this immediate neighborhood, this fuel can be stored safely if it's well monitored and well stored, and at a less cost than it would cost to actually create this consolidated interim storage. And the monies saved could be put as Representative Welch's bill suggests could be put into those local communities that for so many years hosted the plant and should be compensated for the storage of the fuel. I had just one question of Tony about if the CIS plant, which is scheduled for or proposed for Andrews County in Texas, which is not able to take the Holtec system, would that leave Vermont Yankee high and dry in terms of where its gas could possibly be stored on an interim basis?
Well, I'll just reiterate that the proposal for Eddy Lee County, the Holtec proposal, Vermont Yankee is using Holtec storage systems, and right now their first phase is proposed for Holtec storage systems. I can't speculate what WCS will do in the future.
Yeah, Eddy Lee, is that the name of the?
Yeah. What that comes from, Eddy Lee. It's the two counties in New Mexico that are part of this alliance to open this New Mexico CIS. And apparently they've been around longer. They were working with someone else prior to Holtec coming in on this as well. So apparently the Eddy Lee Alliance has been around since about 2006 is what I'm aware of right now.
And one of the things, we don't want to get in a huge discussion about this tonight because we want to do this at a larger forum about the storage thing. So I don't want to put Tony on the spot too much because we basically asked him to tell us just what he knows.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any suggestions on what they want us to talk about in the future? Clay, if you could tell us who you are and where you're from.
Hi, Clay Turnbull. I'm with New England Coalition on Nuclear Pollution, trustee and staff. And I will suggest that next year discussion revolve around what the end state of Vermont Yankee will be. What will the end state be? And I think that term hopefully speaks for itself. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Does anyone else in the public have any suggestions about issues that we should be talking about next year? All right, thank you. And people can offer suggestions at any time, so this is not your last opportunity. What we'll do is we do have a committee that gets together every once in a while and looks over things and figures out where things should fit in. So what we'll do is we'll probably have a meeting of that committee and then update everybody at our next meeting on what the plans for 2018 are, if that makes sense to everybody. Next up, we're still talking about going forward, and I'm going to say a couple of words, and if David Andrews wants to either add or contradict me, I want you to feel free to do that. We have each year a report that we have to provide the legislature and the governor. And what did we do? 2014, 15, 16? I don't know how many reports we've done. 3. And they have been long and hard to put together. So we're going to try to do it a way that's not like putting your senior thesis together, because we're like a bunch of volunteers putting this thing together. So, and I don't know if people have seen, I don't know how many people have read what we've actually done in the past, but it's gotten very particular about this, what we talked about at this meeting, this is what we talked about at that meeting, and what David and I were talking about, and he's actually contacted other members of the panel just to get some, like, are we going down the right path, is to do something more issue specific, as opposed to literally, I don't know how many dozens of pages this thing turns out to be. So I don't know if David wants to add, because you had conversations or contact with a couple other people.
Yeah, I spoke to a couple other panelists, and the concern is we put out a 15 or 16 page document that lands in the middle of March up in the State House when everybody up there is already up to their eyeballs in paperwork, and we give them this dissertation. We wonder how many people are actually reading it and what they're getting out of it, and is there a better way to go about it, since the whole purpose of the report is a report to the legislature to tell them what we're doing. And the idea we're coming up with is a report that's a couple of pages long, 3 or 4 pages. It highlights the major things that we've discussed, the issues that we've brought up, any positions that we've taken, and we'll include an appendix that links you to the state website. We can actually get the minutes, and you can get the position papers and all the other relevant documents. But there's no reason to regurgitate it twice if there's already a reference out there for people to go to. But a highlight of the major issues we've addressed, our online resources, things that preliminarily we're looking to take up in the following year, and what we see are the big issues going forward. Clean, simple, and concise. It'll also be a lot easier to put together in the first year. And so far it seems to, it has wings. It would make sense that we could be working on this over the holiday break here and have a draft, almost finished product to present at the January meeting, and then after that we can bring it up to the legislature and do a presentation like was done last year, early on in the season. So in case there is any legislative actions that are required, we're not asking them so late in the season that they can't really act upon it.
And I saw Representative Dean raising his hand. I'm calling on you. Hopefully you're going to give us your Representative Dean perspective.
Yes, I am, because, and you touched on it as part of your sort of last sentence or last paragraph in your remarks, and that is the legislature, we're interested in what you do. We got a lot of other stuff to read, so maybe we don't want to read it in detail, but what do you want of us?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what is out there that is impeding progress that we can fix? And so I'm not suggesting that in every annual report that you have some big ask of the legislature, but please keep it in mind as you're writing the annual report, because we want to know, how can we help?
Mm-hmm.
How can we help the ultimate success of decommissioning the Vermont Yankee campus to the highest standard? I'm not going to say a word. I'm just going to say the highest standard.
Yeah, and I just want to say, while you have your Representative Dean hat on, that you've been really helpful to us on getting us the public forum when we go up to the legislature and meet with the committees. And I think last year we went and we had the joint meeting between the House and Senate committees. And as far as I could tell, almost I think every member of those committees was there, and the room was packed. So there is a lot of interest by the legislature in what we did. So we're going to be asking the 2 reps down there to help us do that similar thing, because it was, from a perspective of a panel member, it was very nice to see that actually people seemed to care what was happening.
For all the years that most of us sitting at the table and sitting out there have been involved with Vermont Yankee, yes, it is a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if anybody has any comments, Jim.
Just real quick, one thing I hope we can do, and I've brought this up before, but in the past we've tried to tackle recommendations on controversial issues, and the way we're formed, it's a version of what a friend of mine likes to call participatory impotence. A veto, if everyone's got a veto, we see it at the UN this morning, it doesn't work. But I think we can recognize that respectfully and still identify controversial issues that we think the legislature needs to be focused on, and say honestly, here's a quick view of one side, here's a quick view of the other side. We're not prepared to pick one for you, but you need to know about these because they're important.
I think the goal is to have something for everybody to look at, to hopefully approve at the January meeting. Obviously, we'll circulate something around, so by the time it gets to the January meeting, people have seen it, and it's not going to hit your inbox the night before. And so if everybody's okay with us not doing the college thesis and doing it sort of more like you're in a high school thesis kind of thing, it would be really helpful. Okay, thanks. And then that brings us to our 2018 meeting, proposed meeting dates, and I don't want anybody who's new to the panel to freak out. What we've been traditionally doing is having our meetings on the fourth Thursday of the month. And what we've done is to make it so our lives are easier and we're not all doing either doodle polls or taking out our calendars at every meeting. We have always put on our calendar the fourth Thursday of every month, and then as we go along, we say we're really not going to have to meet in February. You know what I mean? So does that make sense to everybody? Do it what we've been doing it in the past. And our first definite meeting will be on January 25th, unless there's some reason to meet before that, if everybody's comfortable with January 25th. And I know there was some talk at the last meeting that some people from the state might not be able to be here, but we've all decided we just have to go along forward with a date. So if everybody is comfortable with this proposed, oh, Joe is raising his hand.
I don't know how significant it would be, but, you know, Entergy will have a problem in January. Obviously, we're going to be in the hearings as well, so I just want to throw that out. I know it's obviously a huge impact on the state, but at least myself and probably some others may not be able to make that meeting as well. So
Okay.
I just want to make sure the panel is aware.
Okay, thank you so much, and we can work around all of that. So is everybody comfortable going ahead with these as our proposed 2018 meeting dates? No objections?
Yes.
No objections. Now I want to move on to public comment on things that we have not already talked about. Is there any last comments from the public for our last meeting in 2017? Oh, Skylar, come on up.
Thank you. I'm Skylar Gould again, in New England Coalition. I'm not sure this is appropriate time. If there is any time, I asked you, Kate, about when time is and could be available to address issues that came up at the beginning of this meeting. So I wanted to ask Mr. Lynch about the water, the incursion into the turbine building.
Sure.
And it's fairly straightforward, and maybe you can't answer the question now. As much as this has been fleshed out here and in the press, I'm wondering where, I understand that the contamination is in the turbine building. It's unclear to me why the contamination is there. Where exactly is it? How is it that through what fissure or crack in what foundation or what vessel is the groundwater contacting this contamination? Has it been determined that there is no exchange outward from this contamination into the groundwater that isn't actually being collected into the turbine building? And how deep is this incursion taking place? I think I understand that some of these foundations run well into the groundwater and even into the water table. How is this, this is another larger question, how is this going to be removed? I mean, is it clear that North Star is going to be able to remove these foundations, these contaminated, whatever it is, foundation structure, whatever it is that all going to be removed, or is it 30 feet underground? They're just going to fill it up, that foundation with rubbleized concrete and cross their fingers. So that's one question about this contamination.
Is that the only question you have? Why don't you ask them all at the same time?
Okay, great, thank you. David Andrews, thank you for your presentation. I was hoping, when you were talking about residential, residential farmer standards, industrial standards, what do those doses actually mean? I understand, for instance, the NRC, standard is deemed at 25 millirems per year, I think all pathways. But I think I understand that residential farmer standard, for instance, which you didn't really address what that meant, residential farmer standard, which is what North Star has been saying that they're going to bring the standard up to. I think I understand that exposure is for an 8-hour day, and that, in fact, the standard for a farmer who works more than an 8-hour day would be higher than the designated dose, whether it's 15 or 25 or 10 millirems per year. And then regarding the ALARA, something as is reasonable, is reasonably attainable. Can that go the other way? Jim Mattow, you were suggesting that it might be reasonable to reach a lower standard. Is it possible that there could be contamination, unanticipated contamination, which would add so much to the cost in the context of this reasonably attainable standard, that there would be allowance by the NRC or by the state necessarily, perhaps if it's other contaminants that the state is responsible for, that it would actually be deemed allowable to have it much higher than what the prescribed standard was.
Joe, do you want to go first and answer?
Yeah, mine will be fairly short. I think Skylar asked a lot of very good questions. I think there was 8 or 9 that I captured. So I think it's probably best that we talk about it at a future meeting, as I would have to do some research into, exactly how the water is getting contaminated. It has to do with the structure of the turbine building and sumps that are installed. So I think that might be a real good topic for the future and better understand. And also, what are the actual levels? They're fairly low. So all of that, I think, might be a good topic for the future.
Okay.
Not January.
Not January. Any time but January. And David, do you want to answer any of those?
I can certainly take a stab, Skylar. So the first is I heard some confusion that you talked about residential farmer standards and talking about the dose. Remember, residential standards are non-radiological standards. So that's non-radiological contaminants. So the word dose, I'll be careful here. When I'm speaking of dose, I'm speaking of radiological dose. There is a dose that you get from non-radiological sources, right? But in terms of what we're talking about, radiological dose, that's the residential standard does not apply. Right. So let me take a stab at that. Okay. It goes to and this it's an important point. Remember, one of the definitions was critical group. So the use of the property determines what the critical group is, and the critical group determines how much time they're spending there. So the dose that a critical group would receive if it's an industrial site would be different than if it's a residential site. So remember, the radiological criteria for unrestricted use talks about the TEDI that the average member of their critical group receives for unrestricted use. Now, as far as ALARA goes, ALARA can be a very subjective a phrase, and we use ALARA in an everyday function at work. There's ALARA groups. We have discussions about an effort that we want to do to reduce a dose on a particular job. Is the efforts and the time and the cost that we want to implement, is it worth it for the dose reduction that we're going to receive? Every instance of that is a judgment call. You can work it out, if you will, in some cases to $1 per rem if you want to play it that way. But the key is as low as reasonably achievable. So in some cases, that's the eye of the beholder. Does it go the other way? One has to bear in mind that if you're raising the level above 25 millirem, it's no longer unrestricted. Making a site or any portion of a site restricted now has significant costs to the licensee of that site. That's a very strong incentive to get the dose rates down below the 25 millirem. That all factors into that, Alara. Is that making sense? Okay.
Okay.
Hey, Tony, this is Bill Irwin.
Hi, Bill.
I wanted to address Skylar's questions to some degree. First, he was asking about the resident farmer scenario, not a residential scenario. The resident farmer scenario is a part of the MARSIM decommissioning process, and it's a standard that's established, and it has been proposed by Entergy in the past, and its PSDAR, and also by North Star in its PSDAR. And it would really take more than I'm prepared at this point in time to discuss what the resident farmer scenario is, but very briefly, it is based on a resident who lives on the property, is exposed to radiation from everything there on and under the soil, grows food in the soil and consumes it constantly, and drinks water on the property and consumes it constantly. And that's why it's called the resident farmer, because that person's not just getting exposed from the ground, but from actually consuming food and water from the ground. Second, with regard to Alara, the as low as reasonably achievable approach to radiation protection, Alara does not go two ways. It only goes one way. There are limits. The NRC, the state, EPA, and others have limits. And going as low as reasonably achievable is an approach that says you must abide by the limits, but the goal is not just that, but to try to reduce the exposures, the doses, as low as reasonably achievable, keeping in mind the costs to society and other factors. So hopefully that can help to some degree with those questions, and I'd be glad to follow up on it further, especially this resident farmer issue.
Yeah, Bill, thank you very much. Is it possible that when...
Can I just interrupt for 1 second? If we're going to... I don't want us to get in a 20-minute discussion about this now, if we can do it later when we can all understand it better. I mean...
Right. Sure.
I mean, I don't know if Bill can... If you're going to answer a question that he can answer quickly, or we should wait until the next meeting and have a...
Well, I guess a simple question, which may need to be answered at another time. Is it possible that when the plan is being decommissioned, that is there some kind of formula or protocol in the decommissioning plan, which might, if there's monies being saved in this area and there's less radiological contamination in this area, that those funds would reasonably be shifted to lowering that contamination and achieving a higher than originally projected contamination level?
Well, I'm not exactly sure if that would be the best description of the process, but I can tell you that agencies for the state and North Star and previously Entergy have worked to try to come to an agreement or agreements that are best for the public and the environment in the final end state. Obviously, whenever there are negotiations, there is a give and take, and we are, as everyone knows, still in those steps of making those final negotiations and coming to some sort of agreement that would be signified in the Public Utility Commission final adjudication of the docket that we're watching now.
Sure. Very good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just,
Bill, this is David. I just added one more item for our 2018 discussions. You threw out the term MARSIM, and I think we should probably be discussing MARSIM modeling and exactly what we're talking about. So I've added that on for 2018.
great, thanks.
Yeah, that'd be good. I'd be glad to do some research, make a presentation on that in the future.
Great, thank you. Just to recap for everybody, our next meeting will be January 25th, 2018. And for the public, Tony will post the 2018 meeting dates on our state website. And I just want to make an announcement that this is Jack Boyle's last meeting as he is retiring from Entergy at the end of the year. It might almost be... Jack, we might just do a December meeting just for you, Jack, but...
No, Kate, don't go to that trouble, please.
So we just want to say thank you, Jack, for being with us on the panel. And do you want to, I don't want to be the one that tells who's taking your place. I don't know if you want to make that announcement now or...
Yeah, we've made the announcement within the company just recently. A gentleman named Corey Daniels, who is the senior manager of production. So he has operations, maintenance, some of the science areas, a direct report of mine. So he will be taking my place, and this will be effective at the end of this year. So starting January 1, Corey Daniels will be in my stead, and you'll meet Corey. He wanted to be here tonight, but he's got a higher calling. He's actually fishing up in upstate New York. He's on vacation, so we did not call him back.
Well, we hope you enjoy your retirement and are going to go somewhere warm, at least for the winter.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I appreciate that.
So is there any other business before we adjourn? Or somebody wants to make a motion to adjourn? And we'll see each other next year. We have a motion to adjourn. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. So Happy New Year, everybody. Unless there's some big event that happens, we'll see you at the end of January.